The air in The Anchor and Chain was a thick, stratified history of minor sins. At the bottom, clinging to the perpetually sticky floor, lay the ghosts of spilled beer and shattered hopes. Above that, a layer of stale cigarette smoke, a phantom from an era before base-wide smoking bans, stubbornly refused to be exorcised by the wheezing air conditioner. The top layer, circulating listlessly under the jaundiced glow of neon beer signs, was the smell of frying oil, cheap whiskey, and the damp, salty tang of the sea that pressed in from the docks of Naval Base Coronado just outside. It was a place built for noise, for the boisterous exhalation of men who spent their lives in disciplined silence. A pressure valve for the violent energies of the United States Navy's most elite. Tonight, the valve was wide open. At the center of the noise, holding court like a feudal lord in his mead hall, was Lieutenant Commander Jake Rourke. His call sign, Bull, was less a nickname and more a diagnosis. He was a slab of a man, carved from the granite of 100 unforgiving coastlines and hardened in the kiln of a dozen forgotten conflicts. His face, weathered and tanned, looked as if it had been chiseled by naval tradition itself. A strong jaw, a nose that had been broken more than once, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He wore his authority not like a uniform, but like a second skin. It radiated from him, a palpable heat that drew the younger SEALs in his orbit closer, their own confidence kindled by his bonfire of self-regard. They laughed when he laughed, drank when he drank, their faces a mixture of admiration and fear. "The problem," Bull declared, his voice a low rumble that effortlessly cut through the bar's cacophony, "isn't the integration, it's the expectation." He slammed his heavy glass mug on the scarred wooden table, sending a spray of foam across its surface. "They want to put women in the teams, fine, but they want us to lower the standards to do it. They talk about equity. Equity doesn't stop a bullet. Equity doesn't haul a wounded man out of the fire. The pipeline is a meat grinder for a reason. It weeds out the weak. It doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about one thing. Can you do the job when everything has gone to hell?" His audience of younger operators nodded in fervent agreement, their expressions grim and serious. They were acolytes at the altar of hard-won experience, and Bull was their high priest. He was preaching the gospel they already believed, reinforcing the walls of the exclusive brotherhood they had bled to join. He was right. He had to be right. Their entire worldview was built on the foundation of that certainty. In a dim corner of the bar, far from the gravitational pull of Bull's personality, a woman sat alone. She was a study in deliberate anonymity. Had anyone bothered to truly look at her, they would have seen nothing remarkable. She wore simple dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, and sturdy-looking boots. Her hair was tied back in a neat, functional bun, and she wore no makeup. She might have been a graduate student, a librarian on vacation, perhaps a civil servant from one of the administrative buildings on base. She was of average height and slender build, a stark contrast to the hulking frames of the men who dominated the room. She held a thick, dog-eared paperback in her hands, its title obscured by her fingers, and seemed utterly absorbed. A small island of stillness in the bar's turbulent sea of testosterone. She had been aware of Lieutenant Commander Rourke from the moment he had entered, not because of his volume, but because of the way the room's energy had instantly reoriented around him. She felt the shift in atmospheric pressure, the subtle change in posture of every other man in the bar. She had a doctorate in physics and another in structural engineering, and she understood complex systems better than anyone. A crowded bar full of elite warriors was just another kind of system, governed by its own laws of gravity, attraction, and repulsion. And Bull Rourke was a supermassive star, warping the fabric of the space around him. She continued to read, her focus absolute. Her presence was a null signal, a void in the room's spectrum of loud signals. She was not a participant, she was an observer. Or so she thought. Bull, fueled by whiskey and the adulation of his men, was scanning the room, his gaze a proprietary sweep of his domain. And then he saw her. He saw the quiet corner, the book, the woman who did not belong. His eyes narrowed. In his world, things had a place. People had a category. A woman like that, sitting alone in a seal bar on a Friday night, was an anomaly, an error in the code. And Bull Rourke did not tolerate errors. He saw her not as a person, but as a symbol. She was the embodiment of the very thing he had been railing against: the civilian bureaucracy, the academic theorists, the pencil pushers in Washington who thought they understood the nature of combat because they had read a report about it. She was the walking, breathing representation of the pressure to change, to dilute, to soften the hard edges of his world, and she was trespassing in his sanctuary. He pushed himself up from his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. A hush fell over his table as his team watched him, sensing a shift from philosophical complaint to active engagement. He moved toward her corner with the predatory grace of a shark, his large frame parting the lesser patrons like a bow wave. He stopped in front of her table, casting a long shadow that fell across the pages of her book. She did not look up. She simply continued to read, as if a 230-pound wall of muscle and righteous indignation had not just materialized in front of her. This, more than anything, stoked the fires of his irritation. He was accustomed to being acknowledged, to being seen. Her deliberate indifference was a profound insult. It was a denial of his existence, of his importance. "This isn't a library, lady," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Slowly, deliberately, she finished her paragraph. She then placed a thin bookmark between the pages and closed the book, the soft thud of its cover barely audible. She lifted her eyes to his. They were a calm, clear gray, like a winter sky, and held no trace of fear or intimidation. They simply registered his presence, analyzed it, and waited. "I'm aware of that, Lieutenant Commander," she replied, her voice quiet but perfectly clear. It was a voice accustomed to precision, not volume. The use of his rank surprised him, and for a fleeting moment, it threw him off balance. But he recovered quickly, his arrogance reasserting itself. "Then you must know you're in the wrong place. This is a private conversation." "This is a public establishment," she stated, not as an argument, but as a simple correction of fact. "And your conversation is loud enough to be public domain." A murmur of amusement went through the SEALs, who had drifted over to watch the confrontation. Bull's face darkened. He was being challenged, not with aggression, but with a calm, infuriating logic. He felt the need to reestablish his dominance, to put this woman, this civilian, back in her place. "You see, that's the problem," he said, leaning forward and placing his massive, scarred hands flat on her small table. The wood creaked in protest. He was deliberately invading her space, a classic intimidation tactic. "People like you think you can just wander into our world, listen to our conversations, and have an opinion. You read books," he sneered, gesturing at her paperback, "and you think you understand. You haven't seen what we've seen. You haven't done what we've done. You have no idea what it takes." She did not flinch. She did not lean back. Her posture remained unchanged. She was like a stone in a river, allowing his torrent of words to simply flow around her. "And what is it you think I don't understand, Lieutenant Commander?" The question, so devoid of emotion, so clinical, was like a spark on gasoline. His control snapped. "I think you don't understand that war is not a theory. It's not an engineering problem. It's a physical reality. It's about strength, endurance, the will to fight and to win, things you wouldn't know anything about. Women can't fight. Not like we do. It's not an insult. It's biology. You're not built for it." He had finally said it. The raw, unfiltered prejudice that underpinned his entire worldview. The room was silent now, the other patrons watching the drama unfold. This was more than a simple bar argument. It felt like a trial, a public referendum on a deeply divisive issue, and this unassuming woman was the defendant. She considered his statement for a moment, her head tilted slightly, as if she were examining a curious specimen under a microscope. "You believe physical strength is the primary determinant of combat effectiveness?" "It's the foundation," he shot back. "Everything else is built on it. You can have all the brains in the world, but if you can't carry your brother out of a firefight, you're a liability." He puffed out his chest, a caricature of masculine pride. "I bet you couldn't even last 10 seconds in a real fight. You probably think a black belt from some strip mall dojo makes you a warrior." Her expression remained placid, but a new light entered her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more analytical. It was the look of a predator that has grown tired of a lesser creature's noisy display. She was a lioness, allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, and the dance was becoming tiresome. "Your assumptions are extensive," she said softly. It was the only judgment she offered. Frustrated by her refusal to be intimidated, her refusal to be angry, her refusal to be anything other than preternaturally calm, Bull escalated. He reached out and shoved her table. It wasn't a violent push, but it was aggressive and dismissive, designed to physically express his contempt. The table skidded back a few inches, her half-empty glass of water sloshing onto the floor. She watched the water spill. She looked at the small puddle on the dirty floorboards. Then she looked back at him, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a small, thin, chilling smile that did not touch her eyes. It was a smile that said, "You have just made a catastrophic error." Before Bull could process that smile, before he could launch his next verbal volley, the world outside the bar erupted. A sound like the sky tearing in half ripped through the building, a deafening shriek of tortured metal and hurricane-force wind. The lights in the bar flickered violently, buzzed, and then died, plunging the room into a disorienting darkness illuminated only by the strobing flashes of lightning outside. The building groaned, the windows rattling in their frames as a torrential downpour, thick as a solid wall of water, slammed against them. Simultaneously, every phone in the room began to shriek with an emergency alert, the chorus of electronic screams adding to the chaos. The squall had hit, a freak, unforecasted microburst that had slammed into the coast with the force of a Category 3 hurricane. Through the window, in the brief, brilliant flashes of lightning, they could see the chaos on the water. The sea, moments before placid, was now a churning cauldron of black, mountainous waves, and then they saw it. A massive shape, impossibly large, moving where it should not be moving. The Olympus Mons, a Panamax-class container ship, had broken its moorings. The storm had snapped its hawsers like threads, and now the 80,000-ton behemoth was drifting, pushed by the wind and tide, directly toward Pier 4. A collective gasp went through the room. Every sailor in the bar knew what was at Pier 4. Docked there, undergoing final systems checks before its patrol, was the USS Wyoming, an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. Its nuclear reactor was online. The drifting container ship was not just a threat to a pier. It was a slow-motion battering ram aimed at one of the most sophisticated and dangerous weapon systems on the planet. Panic, a creature Bull Rourke had not encountered in years, began to slither into the room. The SEALs, men trained for controlled violence in predictable combat scenarios, were suddenly adrift. Their training was useless here. You couldn't shoot a storm. You couldn't grapple with a freighter. Bull began shouting orders, his voice tight with an unfamiliar strain. "Someone get a light. Peters, get on the horn to base command. Tell them we have a situation. Martinez, get a head count. Civilian evacuation protocols." His orders were loud, authoritative, and utterly pointless. It was the response of a man trying to impose military order on a problem of physics and engineering. He was screaming at a tidal wave, and his men, sensing the futility, were a jumble of confused, anxious motion. They were warriors without a war to fight, their immense physical power rendered impotent by the scale of the crisis. While chaos reigned, the woman in the corner moved. The shift was profound. The quiet, still observer was gone. In her place was an entity of pure, focused purpose. She rose from her chair, not with haste, but with a terrifying economy of motion. Every movement was precise, stripped of any wasted energy. She retrieved a small, ruggedized satellite phone from her worn canvas bag, its power light a steady green beacon in the darkness. She walked to the window, her steps sure and steady despite the rocking of the building. She stared out at the unfolding disaster, her head tilted, her eyes scanning, calculating. She was not seeing a terrifying scene of impending destruction. She was seeing a dynamic equation with multiple, shifting variables: the ship's tonnage and velocity, the wind speed and direction, the tidal surge, the tensile strength of Pier 4's concrete caissons. She was reading the storm, translating its raw power into data. Then she raised the phone to her ear. Her voice, when she spoke, was transformed. The quiet, conversational tone was gone. This was a new voice, clipped, precise, and imbued with an authority that was absolute. It was the voice of command. A voice that did not expect to be obeyed, but simply knew it would be. "This is Athena. I have eyes on the Olympus Mons. Execute Protocol Damocles. I need real-time hydrodynamic modeling of the channel, factoring for a 7-meter surge and 60-knot crosswinds. Scramble Harbor Patrol tugs Ares and Hera. I don't care who's on duty. Get me their best pilots. I want them vectored to intersect the freighter's bow at a 30-degree angle. Maximum sustained thrust. Repeat, maximum thrust. We are not trying to stop it. We are trying to alter its trajectory by 3 degrees to starboard. That's all I need." The SEALs, who had fallen silent, stared at her. It was as if she had begun speaking a foreign language, a dense lexicon of engineering and naval strategy that was completely alien to them. Bull stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. Who was Athena? What was Protocol Damocles? He was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, but he understood nothing of what she was saying. She paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. "Negative. The pier's lateral shear strength is rated for a glancing impact of no more than 200 kilonewtons. A direct collision from a vessel of that displacement, even at its current low velocity, will exceed structural tolerance by a factor of 12. The pier will not hold. Get me the Wyoming CO on a secure channel. Now. Another pause. She turned her back to the window and faced the room. Her gray eyes swept over the dumbfounded faces of the special operators. I need a damage control team at Pier 4 with plasma cutters and carbon fiber reinforcement braces. And I need someone to get the power back on in this sector. The base's primary grid is down. One of the younger SEALs, a petty officer named Martinez, instinctively took a step forward. "Ma'am, who are you?" She didn't answer him. Her attention was already back on the phone. "Captain Reynolds, this is Athena. You are to prepare for an emergency breakaway. I need you to begin flooding your aft trim tanks. I want the stern heavy. We are going to use your propulsion system to help pivot the ship if the tugs can't apply enough torque. Yes, I am aware of the risks. The risk of inaction is greater." Bull could only watch, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he had just verbally assaulted with the impossibly confident commander, now coordinating a multi-billion-dollar emergency response. It was not possible. She was a civilian. She was a librarian. She was something else entirely. The authority she wielded was not the blustering, theatrical authority he projected. It was quiet, seamless, and absolute. It was the innate authority of pure, undeniable competence. He had spent his life cultivating an aura of power, but this woman didn't need an aura. She was power. Just as the tension in the room reached an unbearable peak, the bar's main door was thrown open with a violent crash. A figure stood silhouetted against the raging storm, rain and wind whipping in around him. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of a long and storied career, his uniform crisp despite the deluge. On his collar were the 3 silver stars and anchor of a Fleet Master Chief. It was Fleet Master Chief McCann, a man who was less a sailor and more a living institution, a legend whose sea stories were taught to recruits at boot camp. He had come from the command center to get a direct assessment of the situation on the waterfront. McCann's sharp, experienced eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with a single glance. The panicked civilians, the confused SEALs, the dark room. His gaze passed over Bull Rourke without a flicker of recognition. Then, his eyes found the woman with the satellite phone, and the entire world shifted on its axis. Fleet Master Chief McCann, a man who hadn't stood at attention for an admiral in 20 years, a man whose casual at ease was a command to lesser officers, instantly snapped into the most rigid, ramrod-straight posture of attention he could manage. His heels clicked together with a sound like a rifle shot. His hand came up in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. "Ma'am, on deck!" he roared, his voice a gravelly explosion that shook the very foundations of the building. It was not a suggestion. It was not a courtesy. It was a primal, instinctual recognition of a higher authority, a fundamental law of the naval universe. The SEALs, trained to react to such commands without thought, scrambled to their feet, knocking over chairs and tables in their haste. They snapped to attention, their eyes wide with confusion and dawning shock. They had no idea who they were standing for, only that McCann's reaction meant she was someone of immense, almost unthinkable importance. Bull Rourke remained frozen for a second longer, his mind a maelstrom of denial. Then his training took over, his body moving before his brain could protest. He lumbered to his feet, his posture a clumsy, awkward imitation of attention. He was staring at the woman, but he wasn't seeing a librarian anymore. He was seeing a ghost. McCann held his salute, his eyes locked on her. "Dr. Thorne, We received your signal. All assets are being mobilized as per your directive. The woman, Dr. Thorne, lowered her phone. She gave McCann a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Master Chief, good to see you. Give me a status report on the tugs. Ares and Hera are 2 minutes out, ma'am. They're fighting the surge, but they'll make the intercept. Good, she said. She then turned her gaze, slowly, deliberately, until it rested on Lieutenant Commander Jake Bull Rourke. Her expression was unreadable. It was not triumphant. It was not angry. It was the dispassionate look of a scientist observing a failed experiment. Bull felt his blood run cold. He felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life, a clumsy, ignorant child standing before a god. McCann, seeing the direction of her gaze and sensing the residual tension in the room, lowered his salute. He looked at Bull, and for the first time, a flicker of recognition, followed by cold fury, entered his eyes. Lieutenant Commander Rourke, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. You will remain at attention. You are in the presence of Dr. Aris Thorne. She is a civilian, which means she does not hold a rank. She holds a designation. She is the director of the Navy's Strategic Maritime Infrastructure and Damage Control Directorate. Around here, we just call her by her operational code name, Athena. The name fell into the silent room like a depth charge. Athena. A name whispered in the corridors of the Pentagon and in the classified briefing rooms of Fleet Command. A legend. Athena was the architect of the Navy's most advanced port facilities, the mind behind the classified damage control protocols that had saved a carrier after a missile strike in the Persian Gulf, the engineer who had redesigned the mooring systems for the entire Ohio-class submarine fleet after a stress fracture analysis she had personally conducted. She held 4 PhDs, spoke 6 languages, and had forgotten more about naval engineering than Bull had ever known. She didn't wear a uniform because no uniform could encapsulate her authority. She didn't need to command ships. She designed the harbors they couldn't live without. She designed this entire naval base, Lieutenant Commander. McCann continued, his voice laced with ice. She personally stress-tested and certified every single bollard on Pier 4. The pier you were about to watch a container ship demolish because your idea of a crisis response was to shout in the dark. The humiliation was absolute. It was a public vivisection of his pride, performed with the surgical precision of McCann's words and Thorne's silent, analytical gaze. Bull's entire identity, the tough, all-knowing warrior, the alpha male, the leader of men, crumbled into dust. He had not just misjudged a person. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of strength. He had mistaken the loudest voice in the room for the most powerful, and in doing so, had revealed himself to be a fool. His challenge to her, his sneering dismissal of women can't fight, his boast about lasting 10 seconds in a ring. The memory of his own words burned in his mind like acid. He had challenged Athena to a fistfight while she was busy holding back a flood. The hours that followed were a blur for Bull. He and his men were relegated to the role of glorified manual labor, following the precise, calm orders relayed from Dr. Thorne. They ran cables, carried equipment, and stood guard, silent and humbled spectators to a masterclass in crisis management. Thorne never raised her voice. She never once looked flustered. She moved through the chaos of the storm and the response like a surgeon in her operating theater, every action efficient, every command lucid. She coordinated the tugboats, guided the submarine captain through his delicate maneuvers, and directed the engineering teams as they reinforced the pier. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the Olympus Mons was safely anchored in the outer harbor. The USS Wyoming was secure, A multi-billion-dollar catastrophe had been averted, not by brute force, but by intellect, foresight, and the calm application of knowledge. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Iris Thorne stood on the pier, her clothes damp, her hair slightly disheveled, but her posture as unwavering as ever. She was talking to Captain Reynolds of the Wyoming. Bull and his team stood a respectful distance away, waiting to be dismissed, feeling like chastened schoolboys. Finally, she finished her debrief and walked toward them. She stopped directly in front of Bull. The sun was behind her, casting her in silhouette, making her seem larger than life. "Lieutenant Commander Rourke," she said, her voice back to its quiet, conversational tone. The shift was more unnerving than if she had screamed at him. "Ma'am," he managed to choke out, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of her boots. "Look at me," she commanded. It was not a harsh command, but it was unbreakable. He forced his gaze up to meet hers. He expected to see contempt, or anger, or at least a smug satisfaction. He saw none of those things. He saw a profound disappointment, the look of a teacher whose star pupil has failed a simple test. "Your behavior in the bar was not a personal insult to me," she began, her voice clinical and precise. "I am not concerned with your opinion of my gender. I am concerned with your professional conduct. What I witnessed was a critical failure in threat assessment. You encountered an unknown variable, me, and instead of observing and gathering intelligence, you made a series of assumptions based on a flawed, prejudiced matrix. You assumed civilian meant ignorant. You assumed female meant weak. You assumed quiet meant harmless." She took a step closer. In a combat zone, an error of that magnitude would have resulted in the deaths of your entire team. You would have walked them into an ambush because you were too arrogant to see the enemy right in front of you. Your pride, Lieutenant Commander, is a tactical liability. Your reliance on physical intimidation as a first resort is a strategic weakness. You do not fight with your body. You fight with this. She tapped her own temple with her index finger. Your body is just the weapon system it employs. She paused, letting the words sink in. You will not be facing a formal reprimand. A mark on your record would be an insufficient educational tool. A flicker of relief passed through Bull, but it was immediately extinguished by her next words. Instead, you and your team are being temporarily reassigned. Effective 0600 tomorrow, you will report to my office at the Naval Engineering Command. For the next 6 months, you will serve as my personal liaison detail. You will carry my analysis kits. You will sit in my briefs on hydroisostatic pressure and metallurgic fatigue. You will learn about the logistical and engineering realities that make your operations possible. You will learn to see the battlefield not just as a kill zone, but as a complex system of physics, architecture, and infrastructure. Your re-education, Lieutenant Commander, begins now. Dismissed. She turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving him standing on the pier, a broken man being offered an unexpected and terrifying path to redemption. The story of that night became a legend at Coronado. It was called The Night Athena Humbled Bull, and it was told and retold, a modern military fable passed down from seasoned operators to new recruits. It served as a potent lesson. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest. Years later, Captain Jake Rourke, no one called him Bull anymore, stood before a class of promising young officers at the Naval War College. He was a different man, leaner, quieter, with the patient eyes of a scholar, not the fiery gaze of a brawler. He was widely regarded as one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the Navy. His signature lecture was titled, "The Asymmetry of Strength." We are taught to value physical courage, he told the rapt audience. We are taught to be weapons, but a weapon is useless without an intelligence to guide it. The greatest mistake you can make is to underestimate your adversary. The second greatest is to underestimate your allies. I learned that lesson the hard way. I once stood in a room with the most brilliant strategic mind I have ever known, and all I saw was a woman with a book. I saw a target for my own insecurities. I postured, I threatened. I was a dog barking at the moon. He paused, looking out at the faces of the Navy's future leaders. She never raised her voice. She never threatened me back. She simply waited. And then, when the crisis came, she saved us all while I was still trying to figure out who to shout at. She taught me that true strength isn't the power to break things. It's the power to hold them together when everything is trying to tear them apart. Your primary weapon is not your rifle. It is your mind. Do not ever, ever let your prejudices tell you who is and who is not a warrior. The lesson was clear, a moral forged in the crucible of humiliation and hammered into wisdom over time. It was a truth as solid and unyielding as the concrete of the pier R.S. Thorne had designed. True strength is quiet. It is competent. It is disciplined. It does not need to announce itself, for its actions are its proclamation. In a world obsessed with the appearance of power, the loud voice, the big muscles, the aggressive posture, it is the silent, unassuming masters of their craft who truly shape the world, who hold back the storms, and who, when necessary, teach the arrogant the humbling, essential nature of true strength.